Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Eileen Z. I'm the president of the Historical Society, and I am just delighted to see you all here. Since we don't have a quorum for our actual members, we're going to disperse with our business meeting, because most of the folks here tonight have seen it in the paper and are basically visitors. The Historic Society is basically the educational branch of historic preservation in our township. When you hear Historic Commission, those folks are tasked with the job of making sure buildings that shouldn't go down don't go down, or they'll do the research, report back to the township, and then get a decision on something like that. Anyhow, we are really proud and pleased to have our fire chief with us tonight. I gave him a call. Anyhow, ladies and gentlemen, it's really my pleasure, and I'll let him talk about himself and his family before he begins, to introduce to you our fire chief, Adam Selski.
Well, thanks very much for having me and us. I'm going to mention some of the other volunteers that are here. As Eileen said, this is our 100th anniversary, so we've been around since 1914. Essentially, before 1914, we relied on Southampton Fire Company. They had a fire company, I guess, in 1909, and if there was a fire here, they had to kind of get their horses and their fire pumper up to Richboro as quickly as they could. And basically the way it worked was Yerkes and Finney from Southampton hitched up their engine. I don't exactly know where the Southampton Firehouse, where was the Southampton Firehouse? Has it always been right there?
Knowles at 2nd Street Pike.
2nd Street Pike at Knowles, so they would bring at the coffee shop there.
Correct, off the street.
Okay. They would bring the engine up, the pumper, horse-drawn, up to Bristol Road, and then Stephen Gill and Milton Luff would meet them with fresh horses at Bristol Road, rehitch the pumper, and bring it up to Richboro. So, right away you can start to think about the time that it took to do that, and the construction of the day. Probably weren't that successful all that often, but it was always a good try. 1913, there was a series of bad fires in Richboro, and I called this the wake-up call, because the folks in Richboro were starting to say, you know what, we need to do something here. In 1913, they got the former Richboro schoolhouse. It went up for auction. They bid $500. Apparently the bids went higher, but they were able to purchase the building for $750. And so that was going to be the first Richboro firehouse, if you will. They remodeled the schoolhouse so that they could put their pump inside. It was a hand pump at first, and then later it was a kerosene power pump. And I think the neat thing is that they actually continued to use the school part upstairs until 1917, while they were building the new Richboro School. So it served a dual purpose. And one interesting thing is, and you'll see a little bit of a pattern. I've always found it kind of neat. I don't know, I think it's more coincidence, but the fire company and the Richboro School seemed to have a lot to do with each other throughout the years, whether it was sharing property or fires or both. You'll see that common theme. So in May of 1914, they drew up a charter, and the Richboro Fire Company was born. I don't know why we always talk about this, but we always say, no intoxicating liquors shall be furnished or used by its members in any form on the property. And that still stands today. And I think that we say that because a lot of folks look at volunteer fire companies as a social place, and that was a place where there was drinking in a bar. And there are some of those. Not here. Not as long as I've been here, and not since we started the fire company. We have very, very strict policies about alcohol use. Of course, somebody had to pay for all this, and back then the way they did it was they raised money. They had carnivals, and they had pancake dinners, and they had minstrel shows, and pretty much anything that they could do to raise money to fund the fire company. And then around 1927, some of the firemen's wives got together and formed the Ladies Auxiliary of the fire company. And they were very active for many years. The Ladies Auxiliary actually was still active when I joined. Not so active anymore. It became more common to absorb the Ladies Auxiliary into the fire department as a unit, as opposed to being a separate organization. So because we had men in the Ladies Auxiliary at one point, we changed the name to Support Services. So that's what the Support Services of the fire company does. But back then they were the Ladies Auxiliary. Now I'm told today, thank you, Jim, that Mrs. Walker was also the one that pulled the hook, right? Yeah, so she would answer the phone, if somebody called the fire department, it rang in her house. And then, where did she live?
Right across the street.
She lived across the street from the firehouse. She would,
Hesses now.
where the Hess is,
Yeah.
and the firehouse was on that corner at that point. And she would run over and pull the hook on the front of the building, which set the siren off, and then the firemen used to come. That's kind of how it worked.
Chief also.
I'm sorry?
Her husband was chief.
I don't know any other chiefs but me. No, her husband was a fire chief. Jack was chief too, so I have to be careful. The fire company had purchased the corner of Newtown Richborough Road and 2nd Street Pike. It's where the current park is today, where the clock is, that corner. Most of you probably remember it as the Arco station, the Atlantic Richfield station. But actually the fire company owned it before Arco. And that's where they built the original, or the next Richborough fire station. There's a picture of it down there. And take a look at it in these books. It's blown up. But it's really neat to see some of these signs. It says Spring Garden Mill, New Hope. And they're all the directional signs and about how long it is. So I guess the fire station faces the Hess station.
Yeah.
That's the orientation in that picture.
In the back was a stage, and that's where they had different things, all the way in the back of the firehouse.
In the back of the firehouse, he said there was a stage, and that's where they had a lot of the different events. And I believe there was many a pancake dinner or breakfast there, and roast beef dinner.
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
You know, if you look at the building here, the white building is the original building, and to the left side of it are a set of garage doors. And that's where we kept the engine. Why did we have a ramp up to the doors? Why was it not built at kind of street level? No one ever could come up with an answer to me for that. It was almost like, well, that's the way we do it.
So let's make up a reason tonight, and that will be the reason going forward. It's because they used to get a lot of flooding in the center of town, so they wanted the building to be high. Does that sound reasonable? Okay. So anyway, and that was the Richborough Firehouse. You see the siren on the top. So I don't exactly know where the hook was that she pulled. Where?
Right in front. Right there.
Right where I'm pointing. I
It was
figured it was.
a service door.
Yeah.
And the firehouse was never locked.
Never locked. Kind of like today. So here's another connection to the Richborough School. In 1948, there was a fire at the school. 18 fire companies fought the fire. They got water out of the creek on Alms House Road. And again, the fire hall was used as a school, except we charged them $7.50. Eileen, about it, huh?
Okay.
Non-tax revenue, as we call it, right? So $7.50 a week. But, you know, again, it's kind of a neat connection between the fire company and the Richborough School. You know, I'll just premise this by saying that where there are people, there are fires. More people, more fires. More people, more ambulance calls. So, you see, I titled this Getting Busy. During the 50s, there was a lot of things going on, but there was also starting to become more requests for service. More people were starting to move up here. In the 50s, was when we really started to get developed. A lot of the kind of what we call Old Richborough and Old Churchville now started with getting developed in the 50s. We were getting a lot of, apparently, pump requests. So they charged $10 for 3 hours and pumping out basements, and then $1 an hour after, I guess. We don't pump basements anymore. And again, as the population rose, so did the number of fires. So 18 calls in 1958 jumped to 46 in 1959. And although that doesn't sound like a lot of calls, it was a lot of calls back then. 46 calls is a lot of calls, 4 calls a month. People had other jobs. They still do today, but they weren't always close to the firehouse, etc. So in '63, a couple things happened. We had a new name and a new place. The members voted to change the name from Richboro Fire Company No. 1 to Northampton Township Volunteer Fire Company, which really is a better description of the service that we provide in the area we provide. And they were up to 100 calls a year, so in '64 they moved the firehouse to its current location right here on Newtown Richboro Road at the end of Township Road. And I found this old picture, and so the Township building is right here, and the police station is right over here, and the Courier Times building is right here. The firehouse, although we didn't put an addition on, is still, actually two additions on. There's an addition on this side and an addition on that side, but it's still in the same place.
Adam,
Yes.
over here. When you just said the township building, is that where now there's a couple little businesses?
No, the Township building is, the current Township building currently sits right where the red dot is. Right behind the fire station. This is the current firehouse today up the street.
The township bought it, the whole 10 acres.
The Township bought the whole 10 acres, and then they actually
Okay.
give us this part until 2062 apparently is the deal. So I'm not going to care.
Well, if I'm still there, I'll make sure you get it.
Exactly.
That was good.
The Vietnam War hit home. I didn't know Bob Scott. Of course, I wasn't around then. I'm sure these fellows did, but we did have a member that was killed in the war. And I'm sorry.
He was in my class.
He was in Jim's class. You know, the fire department is a very, very tight family. You know, sometimes, you know, there's a lot of families inside the fire department, and then it becomes a bigger family. And I say, you know, a lot at some of our gatherings that what's interesting about the firefighters and the fire company in general, all the volunteers, is that, you know, we laugh together, we cry together, we do everything together. But when there's an emergency, we work together. And it's such a tight bond. And I'm sure this was devastating. And I know that because when we've lost some members, at least since I joined, we feel that same kind of devastation. So they actually dedicated the radio room where the fire radios and the siren controllers and all were to Bob Scott, and all the equipment was dedicated to him. We actually had a fund for a long time that was named after him. And I just took a picture. This picture we took today, just so you could see that we have a plaque on the door in memory of him. Somebody also went down to the Vietnam War Memorial and took an etching of his name, and that actually hangs in the radio room as well. In 1974, Kathy Kay, Jack's daughter, became the first female firefighter, and she had been there probably as long as she could remember.
Yeah.
And there she is. It's an article that was done in the newspaper back then. And we have a fair amount of female firefighters today. It's quite refreshing to see how many, even in the county, there's many. But back then, I think she was the only one. I don't know for how long. You know, by the mid-'70s, as you can imagine, the township was in the boom. And the carnivals just weren't making it anymore. So in '76, the township passed a referendum and started the fire mill tax. And that really is what funds us today. We can't raise money to fund our operation. And we also, in addition to that, the township, there's a state fund. It's called the Pennsylvania Fire Relief Fund, Act 84. And basically there's a tax on any insurance company that's not in the state that writes business in the state. They pay a fee or a tax for that. This money goes into one big pot, and then it's distributed based on population to all the volunteer fire companies in Pennsylvania. So it's the combination of those two funding sources that fund our fire company today. Just to kind of give you some scale, you know, the gear that we wear, our helmets, boot, coat, pants, these are some of the questions that I get a lot, so I thought I'd just make some slides, are about $5,000 per firefighter. So you can see the kind of assets we have tied up with 100 people. A pager, like this one here, thanks Stan, that we would wear. This is a voice-activated pager, so the pager actually would activate, and then as the 911 center was dispatching it, we could hear where to go from here. That's $500. Thank you, Stan. And our radios, both the radios in our trucks and the portable walkie-talkie type, they're very expensive. They're $5,500 a piece. They're small computers. They really are. And some of the hose, the supply line, the big yellow hose that you might see in the street when we have a fire, it's about $700 for a 100-foot length. And we have 13,000 feet in our department. Some of our trucks have half a mile of hose because there are sections of the township that don't have fire hydrants. So we do our best to be able to bring our own water. This is a special service truck, and what's neat about this truck, it actually has breathing air bottles in it. So as we're fighting a fire, when you come out, we can take our bottle out, have it refilled in this truck, and then put back on. We can go back in and fight the fire some more. But there is an Adopt a Hydrant program. It's a great program. And essentially, you can imagine if we needed this hydrant for a fire, it really needs to look like this for us. So we're asking folks in the town to go online, pick the hydrant near them, or a group of families near them should pick it. You could actually give it a nickname and take care of it in storms. It saves us an awful lot of time. Here's the website if anybody wants to do that. And another public service announcement is that it's important to keep your address posted. You can't imagine how many folks in this town do not have their address visible from the street. And if you have an emergency medical, if your house is on fire, there's a good chance I'm eventually going to find it. Right? But if you have an emergency medical condition and you're home alone and it takes those extra few minutes because your address wasn't on your mailbox or it was overgrown like this one or we couldn't see it from the street, that could be all the difference between life and death. So we really can't help you if we can't find you. That's what we say. And we have a great website, NTVFC, Northampton Township Volunteer Fire Company.org. And that's 100 years
Wow.
for you. Any questions? Oh my, all right.
Do you still have fire poles and all of those firehouses?
Do we still have fire poles? Fire poles were really for two-story firehouses where the bunk room was upstairs. If we had a bunk room upstairs, we would have a fire pole. We don't have any in any of our firehouses. It's a really neat tradition, and there's a lot of new fire stations that are still built with fire poles today because they do sleep above the engines.
So why not just have steps?
Well, because we're already on the ground floor. All our activities are on the ground floor.
Why the pole? Why
Oh, well, because if you have 6 or 8 guys jumping out of bed, running down the steps together, it's a blueprint for disaster. In bunker gear, in there. So it's a lot easier for them to just go from the second floor straight down a pole. They come down and they jump out of the way and the next guy does.